Picture a time-worn map, crinkled at the edges, its surface graced by the labyrinthine complexity of medieval kingdoms and empires. At the very center, the kaleidoscopic landscape converges into a focal point, Jerusalem. Imagine the clang of swords, the echo of prayer calls, and the fervent hymns singing praise to different gods, all emanating from the narrow, cobblestoned streets of a city at the heart of three great religions. A city drenched in sanctity, soaked in blood, and swathed in myths. This is Jerusalem, and its name alone has the power to ignite passions, as well as warfare. This isn't just geography, it's theology mapped onto earth. In 1095, Pope Urban II issued a celestial clarion call that reverberated through the vaulted cathedrals and rustic chapels of Europe, a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. Fast forward through 9 bloody campaigns over 2 centuries, and despite the monumental effort, the Christian kingdoms grasped Jerusalem for a mere 88 years. The holy city slipped through their fingers like sacred sand to remain under Muslim dominion until the 20th century. Why, despite the lapse of nearly a millennium, does the term crusade still carry the weight of holy war for some and the allure of righteous cause for others? Join us as we embark on a journey where faiths collide, histories overlap, and the quest for understanding is the only compass we have. Welcome to History on Fleek. Background. The very word crusade comes from the Latin root, meaning cross. The cross. Crusade means to be marked with the cross, which the European men who went to Palestine were. Crusaders, those marked with the cross, whether literally as in their tunics or shields, or figuratively, through a blessing by the Catholic Church and the Pope. Today in most non-Muslim countries, a crusader is someone who fights for a cause. Among many, if not most, Muslims today, especially in the Middle East, the word crusade and crusader can really mean only 2 things. A crusader of the Middle Ages or a Western, usually Christian person, who comes to the Middle East as a soldier, no matter what the mission. Memories are long in the Middle East, very long. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim armies that had conquered it in 1071, sending shockwaves through Christendom. Even though the advance of Islam in Europe had been halted at the Battle of Tours in 791, much of the Spanish peninsula was still Muslim, and it seemed as if Islam was spreading everywhere. In a time when most people were very religious and when the Catholic Church was the only Christian sect in Western and Central Europe, a call from the Pope was virtually the same as one from God. For most Catholics, it was precisely the same thing. The Pope was God's representative on earth, and infallible. This was also a time when many people believed that the second coming of Christ was approaching, or would come at any moment. Some were terrified of what might happen to them if Christ came down from heaven and found that his followers had allowed the Holy Land, and especially the holy city of Jerusalem, to fall into the hands of the Muslim heretics. Others believed they could hasten the second coming by retaking the Holy Land, ushering in a Christian paradise on earth. Some believed both. There were 9 crusades between 1096, when the first Crusaders arrived in Palestine, and the 9th Crusade that began in 1271. Other popes and kings called for a crusade afterward, but the responses were underwhelming and did not amount to much. The Crusades were unsuccessful. During 2 centuries of fighting for Jerusalem and the land around it, the Crusaders held it for only 88 years, most of those between the First and Third Crusades, 1096 to 1192. It was held briefly in the 13th century before falling under Muslim control until the second half of the 20th century. Other holy and not so holy towns like Nazareth and Bethlehem were held for a time, as were major ports like Tyre, which the Crusaders used as staging points for yet another attempt at taking Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the holiest city for the Jewish people. It is also a sacred city for Muslims, third in order of importance after Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad was whisked to Jerusalem one night on a winged horse called Buraq, where he ascended to heaven to receive instructions from God, including the command to pray 5 times daily. Unfortunately for the Jews, the place where Muhammad is believed to have been whisked to heaven sits atop the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, the holiest site in Judaism. As you may know, the site of the temple and the Muslim Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque are all in the same location, which has created problems and caused bloodshed up to our time. For Christians, Jerusalem is a site of many of Christ's miracles, his death on the cross, and the resurrection. Perfect storm of religious zeal. Slaughter before reaching the Holy Land. Historians differ on the size of the First Crusader army. Estimates run between 30 and 100,000. For any time, that is a large number of men, many of whom had to make the journey on foot, at least for many miles before they could reach a port where they might find a ship waiting for them. Now, that depended on the man or men who led them. Only about 10% of any Crusader army were mounted knights. With few exceptions, mounted knights were nobles, sometimes very powerful like Richard I, the Lionheart, in 1190. Others were dukes, counts, barons, etc., sometimes powerful and rich, sometimes not. No money meant no ships. During the First Crusade, excitement was so high that getting, supplying, and maintaining ships was not a problem. Though most Crusaders were eager in the extreme to purge Jerusalem of the Muslims, they also had other motives: riches and land. Even the most humble peasant, armed with nothing but a spear and virtually no training, dreamt of looting Muslim treasure and coming home a rich man. Excitement was high. Religious fervor was off the charts. In today's northern France, Belgium, Holland, and western Germany, an army grew, gathered, and marched south towards ports on the Mediterranean. In May of 1096, a Crusader army entered the Rhineland of western Germany. Army might be a generous description. The Crusaders were more of an armed mob than an army. Before they got to the Holy Land, they set about purifying the Rhineland of non-Christians, which meant Jews. Throughout the Rhineland, Crusader mobs burned synagogues and Jewish sections of towns and cities. Worse still, they killed many of the Jewish people they found, sometimes in the most painful and gruesome ways, including crucifixion. As you can imagine, sexual assault occurred on a massive scale. It would be wrong to suggest that most of the other Crusaders and nobles approved of the massacres in the Rhineland, and the mayhem damaged the cause and reputation of the First Crusade. However, thousands of Crusaders did run amok, resulting in the deaths of thousands, perhaps as many as 25,000 or more. First conquest of Jerusalem. After a long siege, the armies of the First Crusade took Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusaders were ready to explode after 2.5 years of fighting, heat, dust, thirst, loneliness, infection, hunger, and disease. It wasn't as if the Crusaders were the only ones who engaged in atrocities like the Rhineland massacre. Muslim armies captured many Crusaders and others during the First Crusade. Most Christian men, and later women, for many had come to the Holy Land with their men. Captured by the Muslims could expect one of two fates: death or slavery. Both of those alternatives often meant a painful death, most often slow one. When the Christian army took Jerusalem, there was celebrating for sure. Many believed they had saved Christendom and would be rewarded with a place in heaven. Widely held beliefs at the time, combined with pent-up frustration and thoughts of revenge, held that killing a heretic, whether Muslim or Jewish, was a Christian duty. So thousands of Christian soldiers did their duty. They rampaged through Jerusalem, assaulting and killing almost everyone they could find. The city's streets and alleyways were filled with bodies, body parts, and blood. Women, girls, and grandmothers were assaulted. Jews and Muslims were killed without discrimination. The slaughter lasted for several days when noble commanders and exhaustion stopped in. No one knows the exact number of dead, but most agree it was over 10,000 and may have been as high as 50. Muslim atrocity. Before the arrival of the First Crusade, Muslims, Jews, and a few Christians in Jerusalem lived in relative peace, even though Muslim kingdoms dominated the city and the entire region. Christians and Jews had to pay more in taxes, and they were often abused, but compared to what happened to the Muslims and Jews during the First Crusade, life in Jerusalem was almost a utopia of tolerance. That all ended when word of the slaughter in the Holy City spread throughout the Middle East. The Battle of Hattin in northeast present-day Israel on July 4, 1187. 30,000 Muslim soldiers led by the famed Saladin faced off against 20,000 Christians, led by Guy de Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, and Raymond III of Tripoli. The battle was a disaster for the Crusaders and turned the tide of the Second and the rest of the Crusades against the Christian armies. Many captured Christian soldiers were killed on the spot. Thousands of them were sent into a miserable life and death as slaves. Hundreds of others were crucified, and their bodies were left to rot for everyone to see. The Second Crusade was the high-water mark of the attempt to regain the Holy Land for the Church, but the atrocities did not stop. For more than another 100 years, the men of the religious armies of both sides killed and tortured one another on a massive scale. This has been History on Fleek. See you next time.